Hiroshima by John Hersey. So it is August 6th, 2023, and that means that 78 years ago today, the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, the first of only two thus far. Although I don't think anybody out there of reasonable intelligence probably thinks that those will end up being the only two. But that aside, in light of the anniversary of this event, I decided to read and review this book because if you don't think that I will exploit large scale tragedy for personal gain, well, keep thinking that. I jest, of course. But all joking aside, this is a book that, after having read now, I can really say that its historical significance vastly outstrips its actual merits because John Hersey's Hiroshima is, simply put, not a very good book, like at all. In fact, I was kind of caught off guard by just how poor I found this book to be, but we're going to talk about that. So, this book holds the distinction of being the first book written about the bombing of Hiroshima. John Hersey was a journalist and war correspondent who went to Japan shortly after the bombing and interviewed lots of the victims and compiled this book, and it was published initially in the New Yorker a year later. Now, um, this book also holds the distinction of having pioneered what is known as new journalism. That is to say, um, a style of reporting which fuses non fictional material with the stylistic aspects of fiction. This book is pretty novel, or it was at the time, because it essentially removes the interviewer, the reporter, from the equation, and it really strove to be a reconstruction of events from information gleaned by the reporter, but told through a third person voice. So this reads actually like a novel, a very, very poorly written novel, but it does read that way. Now, another book that also was written in this style, which I think does it vastly better, would be this book right here, In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. Both of these books are examples of new journalism. They are both what you might denote as nonfiction novels. But Truman Capote's book is leaps and bounds better than John Hersey's because Truman Capote, well, one, it's much longer. Uh, and so there's a lot greater depth. But Truman Capote, A, could write way better than John Hersey apparently could, but he really also took a lot more time with it in fleshing out the material that he's working with. The characters of the murderers in Cold Blood are really quite well rounded. He really took a lot of time rounding these characters out and making them feel fully human. And John Hersey, unfortunately, did not do likewise because the biggest flaw with this book is that it's not very deep with its subjects. In fact, dare I say it, it's pretty shallow. And so that sadly, therefore, blunts the emotional impact of it, or what emotional impact it could have had. And also, the prose in this is the most basic bitch writing I have ever encountered. You know, this really gives Richard Lehman a run for his money in terms of like just dirt simple, no frills writing, and it really hurt this book, I think, because this book is undeniably important. This was the first book that showed to the world, and in particular to America, what the actual effects of that bomb were. It's just that it could have done it so much better and so much more impactfully. But this book, like I said, it's a slim work. It's only 152 pages, and that's part of the problem. So this book follows six characters. I'm not going to go through all of them because their stories are all more or less similar. I mean, they were all there when the bomb dropped. They all survived by the skin of their teeth, but they had to deal with lasting after effects of it for the rest of their lives. So I'm not going to go through, each plot thread, but there are six principal characters in this book, and this book opens with the bombing on like the first page. And to me, that's a mistake because you did not establish any kind of a baseline for what normal life looked like for these people. And this book just feels kind of hasty to me because, like, it's only 152 pages. It was so slim that it was initially published in its entirety in the New Yorker, a magazine. And I don't think it needed to be that way. Like, you're interviewing these people, right? I mean, you have them at your disposal. You can ask them whatever questions you want. You can extract from them whatever information they are willing to give. You could have went a lot deeper into these people's lives than you did, and this book could have been so much more powerful if John Hersey had done that. So we just get these people, their names are just rattled off like machine gun fire, and then it's like, oh, there goes the bomb, and now they're scrambling just to stay alive. And I don't think it needed to open that way. I think you should have gone through these characters one by one and established what their normal life looked like, who their family were, because he just, so much of it is just like, well, her little brother died, don't know his name, her mother died, don't know her name. And what John Hersey did with this book is he apparently just asked these people what they did in this situation and not what they thought or felt. And that is yet another knock against it, is that it is remarkably flat emotionally. And the worst offense that this book commits is that it takes an event of unimaginable devastation and violence in which thousands of human beings were annihilated, and it makes that be boring. That is probably the biggest indictment against this book, is that it doesn't even make the subject matter gripping because it is written so simplistically. Now, I did a little research and I determined I found that John Hersey apparently intentionally wrote this book in the manner he did, which is like something that I could have written in 10th grade. It is that simple. And the lines in this book, like, it literally reads like the bomb went boom, it was loud, it was hot, people died, things fell down, other things caught on fire. Like, it literally reads like that. It is like something a child could have written. And like I said, I discovered that John Hersey apparently said that he wrote it intentionally this way, and I think that was a major mistake. Um, you don't have to be biased with uh, your your recounting of these events, although this book is biased in one way, and I'll get to that. But this was obviously a delicate subject matter at the time that it came out because it was only a year after it happened. And so, like I said, obviously you don't want to be the guy who starts, casting judgments on the moral rightness of this event, because that's a debate that has raged, since it happened, is whether this was actually justified or not. But you don't have to do that. But I think some vivid, lively writing could only have helped this book. Like, it's written in such a dirt simple, basic bitch type style that it's just not engaging in the slightest. And it's not visceral. Like, this was a visceral event. I mean, there were people being literally incinerated in an instant. There were people that were burning to death under collapsed buildings. There were people walking around with what remained of their eyeballs running down their cheeks. There were people whose skin fell off like a snake shedding its skin. Like, this was a visceral, horrifying event. And then the way that he describes it, it's just like, there was a woman, she was burned, she died. Like, that's all he does. And it feels lazy to me. It really does. It feels lazy, or at the very least, like he was scared to actually portray this subject matter with all the horror and gravitas that it really merited. Like, one of the characters in here isn't even Japanese. I'm getting to, like I said, this book is biased in one way, but one of the main characters isn't even Japanese. He is a German Jesuit missionary. And, when he's walking through the devastation of Hiroshima, everything's on fire. People are screaming. There are, dead men, women, and children everywhere. There are people who's literally just are nothing left of them but a shadow on the wall. And it's just like he's walking. It's like it was hot. Everything was on fire, and it's just so minimal. It's too minimal. Like what you could have done, you could have wrote some pretty good lines considering that he's a missionary, a priest. You could have said something like he felt as though his God had forsaken him and that he had been cast down into those regions infernal, and that the bodies which he walked amongst now were the charred damned. Something like that. Actually, that's not too bad if I do say so myself. See, I could have written this better than this book actually ended up being written. You could have just done something like that to at least, heighten the impact, the punch of this just a little bit. But you didn't. It's just the flattest, most lifeless prose I have ever encountered. And now let's talk about the bias with this, because while this was obviously quite early to be commenting on the justification and ethics of this event, and I'm not knocking him for that, obviously, because that's a sensitive issue, and this was just trying to document the happenings of it. So I'm not knocking that, but it is biased in one way, and the way that it is biased is because um, the subjects that he selects for documentation in this book are chosen, I believe, because of what effect he knew it would have on his American readers. So Japan is a nation that is like 98% Buddhist and Shinto, and yet like half of the characters that he chooses in this book to portray are Christians, already like priests and ministers, and then other of the characters convert to Christianity over the course of the book. And it's just like I see what you're doing there. Like that most of the WASP Americans back home uh, probably won't sympathize that well with Buddhists. So you're like, I'll just pick the Christian ones, and that way they'll feel like they have more common ground between them. And I just thought that was kind of cheap. Like you're in a country that doesn't resemble your own by and large in terms of belief and faith, and yet you go out of your way to pick the very few people that do resemble what you come from in America to portray to this American audience, because you, in all likelihood, know that will be more uh, empathetic to them, that they will be able to relate more to characters that resemble them. Heaven forbid you ask the readers to sympathize with Buddhist people that don't resemble them. I mean, my goodness, that's just too much to ask, I guess. But this book does have a bias in it. It's perceptible. It really is that he chose the people that he did to follow. I mean, hell, one of the people in here isn't even Japanese. One of the people is a German missionary. Like, it's just, I wouldn't have done this book like he did. First of all, I could have written this book so much better than it was written. And I'm not trying to puff myself up or anything and say that I'm some great writer, but you don't have to be a great writer to write this book better than it was, because it is very poorly written. Second, I would have structured this different by going into more depth of these characters, what their lives were like prior to the bombing, like Truman Capote did in his book. Different subject matter, but same basic gist. Truman Capote really went deep into the psyches of the subjects of his book, and John Hersey didn't in his. It's very removed, arm's length kind of thing. These people are just names on paper, and that's not what it should have been, because these were people's lives. They lost everything, and if they were fortunate enough to survive. Many of them probably wish that they hadn't, and then they had to contend with these horrific after effects for the rest of their lives, many of which were, you know, greatly shortened because of this event. And your method of portraying this event is to write it like something a high schooler would have written, with no depth given to these characters and no vivacity to the prose. It's just a disappointing book. It really is. And like I said, this book is important undeniably because this was the first book to be written about this. This was, many people's first exposure to what this event really looked like. So I'm not shitting on it unnecessarily because I mean it's important. I'm not shitting on it unfairly. I think because it's important and it deserves its place in history. But there have got to be better books out there on this subject by now than this, because if this is the bar, that's pretty sad, because this book it's a thin book, and it's also thin in more ways than just its actual length. It's thin all around, really. So to rate John Hersey's Hiroshima, I'm going to be very, very generous. I mean, incredibly generous with this book, and give this a C minus, because it was, like I've said, the first book that was about this occurrence. So I'll give it that. And also, it did pioneer a new style of writing. It did really kind of kick off the movement of new journalism, of reporting um, nonfiction events through the lens kind of fiction, and therefore making things more readable and hopefully more impartial as well. But yeah, everything about this book has been done so much better by other books. Again, Truman Capote's book just blows this out of the water. But yeah, I'll give this a C minus. So, have you read Hiroshima by John Hersey? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said about it here today. And if you haven't read Hiroshima, I'm not going to recommend it. It's important, but it's not very good, I'll say. And if you would like to learn more about this subject, about this topic, I'm sure there are better books out there by now about it than this. Or you can always just give it a good Google. You can get probably better and more plentiful information about it on the internet than this book provides, because this book doesn't provide much. But yeah, and as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.